Hi, and welcome to Quid Pros Quo. I'm Zac.
And I'm Rin.
And today, we are talking about short stories.
This is so exciting.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this. I have written quite a few short stories, and they're so much fun because you get to try out things without the commitment of doing a novel, where you can finish a short story in a relatively short period of time, whereas a novel is some commitment that will take multiple months to multiple years, depending on what your process is and how that ends up working. So I'm super excited for this episode.
Yes, this one will be good. For some reason, short stories are often absolutely unhinged. Everyone read, like, The Most Dangerous Game in high school, I think, or The Landlady by Roald Dahl, The Lottery, Shirley Jackson.
Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut is one that I keep coming back to. I'm always thinking about Harrison Bergeron.
That is so valid. I haven't read it, but that's valid anyways. But just because most short stories are unhinged doesn't mean yours have to be. Like, you can write unhinged short stories if you like. I have one that I'm considering writing for my final for my short story class this semester, where you're like, you have this vampire ex-boyfriend who's like super jealous and he's starting to like murder all your new boyfriends. Oh. And so now you have to go and kill your vampire ex-boyfriend. And I think that will be the most unhinged short story I've ever written. But you can also write, like, wholesome short stories, or, like, you can write short stories based in your universe that you've created of your novel. Like, I've written several, like, Wonderland short stories.
Yes. A short story that I published a few months ago is called Spark, is set in the same world as The Black Crescent, which you've read.
Oh, yes.
Completely different characters, completely different setting, but, again, it's set in the same world. And short stories let you try new things and help you to kind of focus your writing on one particular aspect of the process. So it can help you become more direct and efficient with your language. It can help you with your pacing, and it can help you to develop your skills with conflict. When you're thinking about conflict in the context of a short story, the scale of the conflict needs to be such that it can be solved in the course of a short story rather than a novel. That's, you put asterisks behind every writing rule ever because, of course, you can break the rule where it's like, okay, well, if the novel can do the overthrowing the big bad evil guy thing, then, well, my short story can't do that. And that's not true. You could do that.
Yes, but
absolutely,
you have to, know the rules before you can break them.
Yes. And one of the things that was really helpful for me when I was thinking about short story conflicts is to think about TV shows with an episodic format. So these are shows like SpongeBob, Jimmy Neutron for younger audiences, and then with older audiences, this is more along the lines of like Psych or for people who are even older, Seinfeld, where you have the status quo. And I will use SpongeBob as an example, and I will use a very specific SpongeBob episode as an example. For SpongeBob, you have the characters, and they're stuck inside of their lives, and the point of each episode is to introduce some disruption into the status quo. So in the episode that I'm thinking of, Squidward gets hit in the face with a door, and he becomes beautiful, right? So he has this new life where he's beautiful and people are paying attention to him, and that's the disruption, and we develop that over the course of the story where it's like, oh, what is it like to have Squidward be beautiful kind of thing. And then you have the return to the status quo where he hits his head against one of the support beams in the Krusty Krab, and he goes back to being ugly. And we return to the status quo. So you have introduce conflict, develop the conflict, resolution. That kind of model can be helpful when you're thinking about writing short stories.
Absolutely. Wow, I feel like you just covered like the whole episode. Nice job.
Thank you.
I would like to talk a little bit about my experience, and I was never really into short stories. I prefer working like long form.
Yes.
But for my English 318 class, it's like entirely short stories. So I've written more short stories in the past like 3 months than I think I ever have in my whole life. Because I've written, like, just so many for this class, like, and so many drafts of it. But we've had focuses on, like, character for one thing and setting for another, conflict for another, and the one I just finished was for the single effect. And the single effect is when everything in the story works on evoking one emotion in the reader.
Yeah.
And this is, like, super important to short stories. It's, like, less important to novels, unless you want a very thematic novel.
Yes.
But short stories, like, especially, like, fairy tales, which is what I deal a lot in, like, fairy tale retellings. Like, you want, like, a moral to the story. You want, like, a theme. So you just have to, like, make all of your word choice and characters all evoke the same emotion. Trigger warning for this next short story I'm going to talk about. It talks about suicide. So if you don't want to listen to that, you can skip ahead a little bit. But I just wrote a short story where, like, the main character's super suicidal and they're on a manic depressive walk, and it was, like, really a hard short story to write. I was, like, crying the whole time. But the, like, one emotion I was going for was, like, this hopelessness. And then eventually, like, twisting that into some form of hope. Like, hope against hopelessness.
Yeah.
And it was so interesting. Like, the way I did this was I used a motif of Van Gogh. Because Van Gogh said the sadness will last forever. Like, those were his final words, la tristesse durera toujours, I believe, in the original French. But I, like, had him, like, themes of, like, Van Gogh and Van Gogh's, like, death, like, woven throughout the story, and, like, that all contributed to the single effect.
And you can use, like, with your examples that you gave there, you had these different aspects of the writing that you were focusing on. You can also use it to practice certain techniques. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about the object correlative. You can practice doing that in the context of a short story. I remember at a conference that I went to, we were in a workshop on the object correlative, and we were just writing just, like, really tiny scenes where we were trying to evoke the object correlative. And I was writing about gadflies and damselflies, and about how they live for a week kind of thing. Yeah. And I used the damselfly as a metaphor for terminal illness kind of thing. I suppose I should put a trigger warning at the beginning of that, too.
I will put trigger warnings in the caption.
Nice.
You will do that because you write the captions now.
Oh, whoopee! But you can focus on, if you struggle with dialogue, you can use a short story to sharpen your dialogue skills. If you're struggling with theme, whatever it may be, you can use a short story to work on that. When I was in high school as a senior, I decided to do this little experiment where for a year I would write one short story a month. So I would, at the beginning of the month, I'd say, okay, what's my idea? And then I would draft it, I would edit it, and by the end of the month, I would have a short story, and so I could start sending it off to short story magazines. I stopped doing that fairly quickly because I realized that nobody reads short story magazines, which is unfortunate. But I was still writing these short stories, and so I have this corpus of work that I can draw on where it's like, oh, here's a cute little story about child trying to communicate with his friend who was deported through paper cranes. Or here's a story about two siblings trying to work through the conflict of living together after their parents are no longer in the picture. Or here's a horror short story that I wrote in an epistolary format, which I had never done before. You can experiment a lot with those short stories.
Of course. As always, show, don't tell. This is super obvious in short stories. Like, one of my drafts for my class, like, my teacher, like, ran and she's like, Rin, this is not your, like, normal, like, prose. Like, this is so tell, not show. And it, like, just didn't work. And then I ended up just scrapping that whole idea and doing something else. But you got to make your words count. You have this money metaphor in the notes. Like, if every word of it were $1, is each part of the story worth the words you're spending it on? And I've never thought about that before, but that's really interesting. Yeah,
when I'm grading student papers, I will often use the money metaphor because they have a word limit. So for one of the last essays that they wrote, they had a 600-word limit. So I'm like, is your introduction worth 125 words? Is it worth $125 when you only have $600 to spend? Maybe not. Maybe you cut it down to, like, your thesis and move on. But in the case of a short story, again, it's like in one of the last episodes I talked about cryogenically freezing large portions of the Amnesia Code, where I took a look at that and I said, this is a 20,000 word story, and this 20,000 word story is not worth $20,000, so I'm going to take out 12,000 words. Nice. And those 8,000 words are much more worthwhile, kind of thing.
Absolutely. That's all the time we have for today. If you want to talk to us about short stories, you should email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. And we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to Quid Pros Quo.